talks this morning, and then short coffee break, and then 2 talks before lunch. Without further ado, I'll introduce Allyson Tessin, who's going to talk about the roles of redox and reactive ion supply and active benthic ion cycle.
Okay. Excellent. Hopefully everyone can hear me. So I just wanted to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me. I'm excited to be here and share some of my, I guess, musings on some of the ways in which iron cycles through marine environments. So I kind of had my marine biogeochemistry hat on today. So I thought I'd start by giving a little bit of background about why marine biogeochemists care about the iron cycle. The first reason is generally that iron can be a biolimiting micronutrient. So what that means is that in certain parts of the modern ocean, the addition of bioavailable iron is thought to be able to fuel more algal primary productivity, which can fix more CO2 as biomass and potentially export it out of the surface ocean. So in this way, when we think about the iron cycle, we're thinking about it as a strong control on the global carbon cycle and also on climate change. So we can see a really good example of that. Here we're looking at modern surface ocean chemistry, specifically nitrate concentrations. Nitrate is thought to be one of the primary biolimiting nutrients in the ocean. So we can see in a lot of the ocean, we see very little nitrate in the surface waters. And in those places, we see green circles indicating that more nitrate would lead to more primary productivity. But in other areas, like in the Southern Ocean, the Northern North Pacific, and some of the Arctic regions, we see that there is still nitrate remaining in the surface ocean, and we see these red circles or outer circles, meaning that iron will either limit or co-limit primary productivity in these regions. So this is really key, again, thinking about those links between the iron cycle and climate change. I also want to highlight that a lot of biogeochemists, even if they don't geek out about iron quite as much as I do, have to think about the iron cycle because it helps to control other biogeochemical cycles. So yesterday, Tim hinted at some of these relationships. And what I mean by this is that certain iron mineral transformations can cause changes in other elemental cycles in the ocean. So a really great example is when we think about iron oxyhydroxide minerals. These minerals have high absorptive potential, which basically just means they're really sticky. So basically, when we think about elements like phosphate or certain trace metals, which can either be micronutrients or super toxic like mercury, lead, and arsenic, or even organic carbon, they will cycle along with certain iron minerals. So if we see iron mineral transformations, those might impact those other cycles. So I have a really simple example here where on the left, we have a system where our sediment, the brown part, has a lot of reactive iron. And that reactive iron is able to trap phosphate as it's released into the pore waters through organic matter degradation, which reduces the amount of phosphate that makes it back into the water column. If we're to eliminate a lot of the reactive iron in that system, we lose that sink and we get a lot more phosphate making it back into the water column. So in ways like this, we need to think about what's happening with iron mineralogy, even if our primary questions aren't about iron. So I wanted to start with this really basic, simple idea of how we think about the marine carbon cycle or iron cycle and how we have for a long time. The main thing I want you to see here is the key importance of dust. So for a long time, we really thought of dust as being the main way to get bioavailable iron to the open ocean. And this is thought to play a really key role in climate change events. So how primary productivity changes on glacial and interglacial cycles is often tied to the dust supply. In the decades since we've gotten a lot better at measuring iron in seawater, and specifically the speciation of iron in seawater, we've increased what we know about the iron cycle. So this is an updated view from a review paper from 2017 that shows some of this new knowledge that we've been able to develop, again, because we're a lot better at measuring iron than we used to be. So there's a lot of new information here. I just want to highlight 2 parts that'll be relevant for my talk. The first is this source of iron from margin sediments. So when we look at our original iron cycle, we see iron moving between the sediments kind of into and out of, but in a not a source or a sink way. But what we've learned is that margin sediments can be a really significant source of iron and particularly bioavailable iron. We've also added this little system at the top, which is the key role of glacial systems. So what I mean here is that things like sea ice, icebergs, or meltwater can all be really significant sources of iron to the ocean. Okay, so as we talk about, I'm going to start by talking about some of these marginal sediment processes. That means it's going to be really key to think about iron reduction and how iron transforms within sediments. So I just wanted to start, I have up here in the corner, just for a reminder for anyone that it's not super intuitive to, oxidized iron, which is iron 3+, within the modern ocean will rapidly oxidize as iron oxyhydroxide mineral. So we don't expect to see dissolved iron 3 in the ocean. Reduced iron, iron 2+, can be dissolved, but generally only in the absence of oxygen and sulfide. The exception to this is liganded iron, but we won't worry about that today. Okay, so yesterday we talked a lot about these ancient settings that have anoxic or euxinic waters, but in the ocean today, outside of the Black Sea and the Cariaco Basin and a few other examples, the ocean's oxygenated. So we can assume that in most cases in the water column, there is oxygen. When microbes are breaking down organic matter, they're performing aerobic respiration. It's just the opposite reaction of photosynthesis. So they are consuming oxygen to break down organic material and release CO2. This changes once we get below the seafloor. So below the seafloor, we can see oxygen start to be consumed, and then other processes become energetically favorable. First nitrate reduction, then nitrate reduction, then manganese, iron, and sulfate reduction, kind of in order, and then eventually methanogenesis will dominate. So one of the key things that I want to highlight here that's really important when we think about iron is that iron reduction takes an oxidized solid iron 3+ or mixed valence state mineral, it dissolves it, and it releases iron into pore water. So we see these reductive processes, again, by microbes to break down organic matter, as a way to move iron between a solid phase and a dissolved phase. Once we get a lot of iron in our pore waters, what can then happen is that iron will diffuse up or down the sediment column until it interacts with sulfide or oxygen and a new mineral precipitates. So this is your friendly neighborhood reminder, especially those of you who think about the sedimentary record, that iron does move around in sediments after deposition. It always does, but sometimes it can be enough to make a big difference. Sorry about that. Okay. So some of the times that this really matters is if we see a system that experiences a key redox change. And so generally in the modern ocean, what we're thinking of with a redox change at the seafloor is a change in the oxidant demand. So oxidant demand just refers to how much material is hitting the seafloor that can be reduced, that can consume electron acceptors. So this can include a lot of species, but for today, we're just going to think about this as being organic carbon. So on the left, we can think of a system. I work a lot in the Great Lakes these days because I'm in Ohio right now. So I like to think of this system on the left as Lake Erie, right? We have this harmful algal bloom that happens every year. Tons of organic matter is fixed in the surface ocean. It falls to the lake bed when everything dies in the late fall. And there's a lot of organic material for microbes to consume. So they consume the oxygen really rapidly, and we see the penetration depth of oxygen being really shallow within the sediment, which means that things like iron and manganese reduction can happen really close to the seafloor, meaning that iron can now move not only within our sediment column, but between the sediments and the water column. We can think about an oligotrophic system, a lower productivity system by comparison, where we get a lot less carbon hitting the seafloor. Here, it takes a lot more depth in the sediment for the microbes to consume all of that oxygen and get to iron reducing conditions. So if you're looking at a system that's stable and you understand what the redox environment was, then you're in pretty good shape. But not all systems are stable, and especially when we're thinking about climate change, we can see rapid changes between different kind of states. So the example that I'm going to use today for my talk is thinking about the Arctic Ocean. The Arctic Ocean is experiencing some of the most rapid impacts of anthropogenic climate change, and one of the most visible versions of that is the retreat of Arctic sea ice. This is really important because the Arctic is actually not nutrient limited. The Arctic is light limited. So it is limited by that sea ice, which blocks the ability of algae to photosynthesize. So if we reduce sea ice, we will expect to have larger algal blooms that start earlier in the year. We also will shift the zone of the edge of the sea ice. This is really important because that's where a lot of the productivity happens. So if anyone's ever been out to sea in the Arctic, you can actually see the sea ice edge from really far away because that's where all the birds are. That's where everything congregates because you have this really high productivity region right at that margin of the sea ice. So we can set up this really simple hypothesis. My colleague Dave Barnes made this cartoon where we warm climate, we reduce sea ice, we have way bigger phytoplankton blooms that move in location and change in timing. They deposit a bunch of carbon on the seafloor, which has big implications for benthic ecology, but also for how much organic carbon is making it into the sediments, what the oxidant demand is of our sediments, and what is happening with our iron and manganese cycling. So the tool that I use, or the sampling tool that I use to ask these kinds of questions is a multicore. Technically, this was a British ship, so it's a megacore because people are pedantic. But we have a core here that's designed specifically for what you can see in this picture, which is that we see right above the sediment this really clear water. So these coring techniques are designed to do a pretty good job of preserving the sediment water interface and allowing us to examine the processes occurring across that boundary. So on the left here, I have two core tubes that are full of mud. You can actually see the redox zonations here based on the color of the mud, which I love. You also can see a sponge that we murdered, but it happens. So on the left, these are the solid cores we take. We then extrude them at 0.5 centimeter to centimeter resolution so that we can look at the solid phase of the sediments, the actual minerals, the actual grains of mud. What's happening on the right here is that we're pulling the pore waters out of some of these sediments. So these funky tube things are called rhizins. Rhizin means root. So it basically behaves like roots do. So we use pre-drilled core tubes. We insert this basically very long skinny filter. We attach it to a syringe to create a vacuum, and it basically sucks out and filters the water at each centimeter resolution down core. So what this allows us to do is look at a solid phase and an aqueous phase, hopefully that are roughly coincident in the sediment, and actually see those active processes that are happening. So for my talk, because the units aren't always intuitive to other people, if you see one of these, it means you're looking at sediment data. So that would be like a % iron from a sediment. If you see this picture, you're looking at dissolved data. Okay, so I also want to highlight one of the things that I haven't mentioned about the Arctic, which is that there's a lot of iron there. Part of that is just a natural part of glacial systems. Glaciers basically act like bulldozers when they move over a landscape, so they can really efficiently grind up and powder sediments. This creates a lot of surface area, which creates a lot of ability for things like iron to be reduced and moved into an aqueous phase. A lot of these subglacial systems are also anoxic under the ice, which is the perfect condition to keep that iron 2+ in solution. So basically, we have these great big ice sheets and glaciers that move over Arctic landscapes and collect reduced species that you might not see move into the ocean with a typical river. So we see this kind of land-sea exchange, but maybe a little bit different than you would expect to see in a normal riverine system. I've been working off of north central Svalbard, which also has this added benefit that the entire northern part of the island is these Devonian red beds. These are basically sandstones that are held together by iron cements. So when that glacial process happens, which will always increase the amount of iron being delivered, here it's really, really efficient. So we get tons of iron that makes it from some of our land areas into the ocean and into the region. One of the ways we actually see that is from some really quirky things that we find when we're sampling there. So one of the problems with multicores, even though we did manage to murder a sponge, is that you get a really small surface area. So you don't get to see a lot of the seafloor when you sample with a multicore. I was lucky on some of my work that I was out with benthic ecologists to gently trawl the seafloor looking for benthic organisms. And they started bringing up these weird hunks of mineral deposits. And they came to us and they said, what are these? And we basically found these really thick iron and manganese crusts. We see them on clasts. We see these really cool ones here, which are kind of like or tube-like. These are actually iron and manganese minerals precipitating along the edge of a worm burrow. So you have a little bit of organic matter that fuels this microenvironment that's just kind of poised to precipitate iron and manganese. We actually what we're looking at here is a shark egg case and a sponge. The lighting's kind of bad, but you can actually see they're coated in a layer of rust. So we have this really rapid iron and manganese cycling that's happening kind of in coordination with our benthic ecosystem. So I guess I spoiled with order, but the region that I was working in was the Bering Sea. So here what we're looking at is the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard. Norway is to the south, between Greenland is to the west, and here we're looking at the Fram Strait. The Fram Strait's really important because it's the one deep water connection between the Arctic Ocean and the rest of the global ocean. So where we were working was in this series of sites that are north of Svalbard. So they represent kind of the marginal edge between the Bering Sea and the open Arctic Ocean. I have colored these sites differently. The white sites are within the Bering Sea slope, is what we'll call them. The gray sites are the Yermak Plateau. So what you can hopefully see here is that those Bering Sea slope sites sit really close to the seasonal ice edge. This is also the seasonal ice edge average between 1980 and 2010. That's the solid yellow line. And so they're currently sitting at this area that's experiencing a lot more productivity than it used to. By comparison, the Yermak Plateau is still pretty stably covered by ice, at least seasonally. Nope, that's a lie. The Yermak Plateau is annually covered by ice. Sorry, just to not confuse. So with the Bering Sea slope, what we see is that in the winter, it is ice covered. And then during the productive season, it is more open. The Yermak Plateau remains ice covered year round. So again, we have our sediment cores. What we're looking at here is sediment data. What I'm plotting is iron to aluminum and manganese to aluminum. We normalize our sediment data to aluminum to control for things like biogenic input. And on the top, we have an example core from the Bering Sea slope. On the bottom, we have an example core from the Yermak Plateau. So just to walk through this, what we're seeing in these Yermak Plateau sites, which are the lower sites, is that iron to aluminum and manganese to aluminum are all very enriched as compared to an average shale, but they're really, really flat. They're stable throughout the entire sediment column. This is really important because it highlights what I mentioned before. This is a system that gets a lot of reactive iron. And at least in these locations, it is staying put. It is staying where it was deposited within the sediment column. We see something a little different on the Bering Sea slope. For a lot of the sediment column, our iron and manganese are falling at average shale. What we see above that are these really distinct enrichments where we see a lot of iron and manganese accumulating pretty close to the sediment water interface. I also don't have time to go through all of the details, but for anyone who's interested or wants to chat more, using the kinds of extractions that Tim talked about yesterday, we see that in this Bering Sea slope, in those iron enrichments, we're getting over 1 weight % of ferrihydrate iron, which is a lot. We're getting a lot of very, very reactive, very freshly precipitated iron oxides. And within these Yermak sites, we're seeing enrichments in the ferrihydrate oxide and magnetite phases. So we see a lot of multiple different phases of reactive iron. Okay, so we're now looking at our horizon picture. These are dissolved data, not sediment data. Same as before, on the top, we're looking at the Bering Sea slope. On the bottom, we're looking at Yermak. This is dissolved iron, dissolved manganese, and now I've added ammonium. You can think of this as basically a proxy for organic matter remineralization. It's released to pore waters as organic matter breaks down. So in those Yermak sites where we didn't see iron and manganese moving around, cool. So what we see in those sites is that our ammonium data implies that there's not a lot of organic matter being remineralized. Our iron and manganese indicate that there's not a lot of iron and manganese reduction. We're not seeing a lot of exchange between those two pools. And it's really strikingly different within the Bering Sea slope, where we see lots of iron and manganese making it into the pore water in combination with the ammonium. For those of you who don't necessarily intuitively see pore water and sediment data, as I do, I'm now plotting those Bering Sea slope data together. So we have our solid phase iron and our pore water iron. And what we're seeing is that throughout most of this core, iron is being reduced. It's moving into a pore water phase. It is then diffusing into that oxic layer where it is precipitating in a really distinct layer. Just to tie this a little bit closer, I just want to highlight that we can couple that to the pelagic process, to that process of surface primary productivity, because we see really high pigment deposition. Those pigments are produced by primary producers within our Bering Sea sites, but not within the Yermak sites. So what we think is happening here is this system where within our shelves in the modern, the Bering Sea slope is experiencing a decent amount of surface productivity, which results in diffusion of iron, resuspension of iron-rich materials right at the surface, and transport potentially out into the Arctic Ocean as a whole. Because Yermak is still covered in ice, we don't see that level of primary productivity, so we don't see that clear pattern of remobilization. But in the future, as that ice disappears and we start to increase the primary productivity over Yermak Plateau, increase the oxidant demand to the sediments, we'll expect that some of these shelf settings within the Arctic might become sources, might become almost benthic shuttles of iron into other parts of the Arctic. And I just want to highlight that that's especially key because the Arctic Ocean doesn't look like most of the ocean. The Arctic Ocean has these really extensive shelves and a really kind of smaller deep basin. And in fact, they contain 15% of the global shelf area, despite the fact they only represent 4% of the global ocean. All of that's just to say that shelf processes here matter more than other places. Okay, so this is just a summary. I also really quickly just want to show an example of how we can look at iron cycling in these regions further back in time. So here I'm just showing one of the sites where we had a multicore on the Yermak Plateau. Now what we used instead of that multicore was kind of the exact opposite technique. This is a casting core. It is designed to get tons and tons of mud. And so you can see my colleague standing there. We got an 8-meter core, but a very large diameter, particularly so we could try and find enough 4Ms to get age models. So again, just reminding you that this is an area where we get this large amount of iron coming off of Svalbard. I also just want to highlight that you can actually see that both in the modern, because you get these kind of pink, orange, and red sediments that move through the Kongsfjord. And if you go back to cores within the fjord, up here, you collect a lot of that material. And in the shelf, you see that you kind of sporadically collect really these kind of pink clay materials. With that in mind, it's been proposed that some of these clay-like minerals that are making it off of Svalbard are only making it far enough to be recorded off the shelf during warming intervals, when our meltwater off of Svalbard is significant enough to deliver that sediment farther afield. So just as a reminder, this paper that's showing that concept is looking to the west. Our site is to the north of Spitsbergen and quite far enough that you wouldn't see it on this map. So what we see when we look at that long core, both with total iron and highly reactive iron, is that we get these pulses of iron that are making it all the way out to Yermak. I'm happy to discuss, if anyone really wants to nerd out later, why we don't think these are diagenetic fronts. It's a fair question if it pops into your head. So we don't think that they are. And we see these kinds of pulses that are occurring, again, not just in iron, but in highly reactive iron. Based on our rough age model, because we did not find those 4Ms that we wanted, you can kind of see that a lot of these pulses line up at the transitions between glacial and interglacial cycles, or within MIS3, where they appear to be roughly coincident with some of the larger, for example, Heinrich events. So kind of the thought I wanted to end on was that as we've been trying to parse apart what is redox and what is iron delivery and where iron is coming from, we use these series of chemical tools like total iron, different sequential extractions like Tim talked about. We also can use tools like Mossbauer, which is a spectroscopic technique that gives us more detailed information beyond what those chemical extractions can tell us. And we can do isotopic work. But what I want to highlight is that it's still really difficult, even with all of these tools, to really get a sense of what that iron mineralogy is. And I think there are really good opportunities to look at these systems with magnetic minerals as an additional tool. So I just wanted to kind of summarize that. I know I went through the long core quickly, but just highlight that we think that we see these intervals where we have this combination of fjord and shelf remobilization and meltwater transport that causes a pulse delivery of iron that's still a little bit difficult to explain, partially because we don't have a great idea of all of the iron transformations that are happening. So there's, I think, lots of opportunities in these kinds of questions to, again, combine proxies for more powerful reconstructions. So with that in mind, I will thank my co-authors were on the first slide. I just forgot to say so. But also all of the excellent people who helped on expeditions and some of the lab techs that I've worked with. Does anyone have any questions?
Great talk, Ellie. Thanks for coming up with that session. We've got about 10 minutes to questions.
Thank you. Allie, that was an awesome talk. Thank you. I'm just wondering, has anybody done any sequencing to look at the bugs in the different redox stones in your cores?
So a little bit in, okay, great question. So at a slight fear, I was going to give a 50-minute talk, so I pulled a lot of things. Okay, so we have the sites that I worked on here. We're mainly a paleo crew, so it was mainly geologists, and they weren't appropriately sampled for that. We've done a lot of work within the Bering Sea proper, where there has been more microbiology that's been done. So we have a sense of what's happening on the shelf, but less so what's happening on like the plateau and margin.
Great, thanks for the talk. I have a clarification question on the last piece, just to make sure
Yeah.
follow the full argument, which was effectively that where you saw the high total iron and the highly reactive to total iron, that is when we were seeing these pulses of these sort of hematite rich clays being delivered on. And that was what was reflected in your Mossbauer as well. So are you thinking those are effectively untransformed iron oxides, iron hydroxides coming out from the
That is an excellent question. So I think our Mossbauer actually showed, okay, so the process that we think is happening is that we know even today that fluctuations in the ice sheet or the glaciers will lead to larger or smaller plumes. This work looking at the pink clays has been able to actually show that off the coast, you get full DO cycles. So every time you have a significant retreat of the ice sheet, the iron makes it here. There are way fewer times that these kinds of clay minerals are making it all the way up to our site, likely by being entrained in these waters and carried there. So that was the first, hopefully, potentially useful clarification.
these aren't pink clays per se. That's where you
They're
get
not.
closer to the mark.
Exactly. So they see these true pink clays. We actually see orange bands. And we see, according to our Mossbauer, that it's either likely something like ferrihydrate or goethite. We also see that in our sequential extraction. So almost all of the iron that's added is in the ascorbate phase. So we actually think what's happening is that you get big pulses of these hematite-rich clays that are deposited in the fjords and shelves. Then benthic remobilization causes that to kind of almost like leapfrog farther along the system. So it's a two-part idea. One is you get a lot of those clays that aren't necessarily transformed moving out to the shelf. And then remobilization and processing of that allows the iron to be moved further.
You can't tell the bottom structure of the Bering Sea building.
Mhm.
It's like your hematite or peroxide or maybe narrow size particles. If they don't see them at room temperature. they
Yeah.
get lost on it, so they're small size.
Yes, yeah, yep.
Were you able to differentiate between peroxide and hematite?
The person who I am collaborating with has been working on trying to further distinguish, but hasn't been able to convince herself yet. Mhm.
So I'm curious about comparing and contrasting this situation in Svalbard
Mhm.
with the ferric oxides to Iceland, where the glacial debris will be mostly magnetite, FeTi
Mhm.
oxide rich. What would there be a different in iron mobilization?
I think that's a great question. I think it depends to some extent. I think you would see slightly different timing of processing, but I would also expect to see really pretty significant benthic cycling of iron within that region where you have those minerals being deposited. And I think a lot of it would kind of be based on whether the minerals that are making it to the shelf are still magnetite or exactly what phase they're making it into the shelf system, or they can be further transformed.
Does titanium have any role in iron-soluble probability?
I think it does in some locations. Here we don't see a lot of titanium. Then I think you would see more of an impact of that.
Yeah, thank you. So there's a lot of interest in the community on trapped redox boundaries.
Mhm.
And you already mentioned this, so
Yeah.
maybe you can expand upon that. And the second question is really kind of expanding on.
Yeah.
That with this alluded upon. It's interesting, and maybe this is a local case, but there's a Cretaceous large igneous province all throughout that area,
Mhm.
which would be a source for other oxides, but you apparently don't see them in these sources.
I think that based on the way that the circulation patterns are moving and where our sediment sources are, most of that is coming from the Svalbard fjords. But I think we do see, well, I'll answer your first question first. So as a person who thinks about iron geochemistry, every time you see big spikes like this, the first thing you ask yourself is, are these buried redox fronts? We are still constantly, every once in a while, I still ask myself and become full of doubt. One of the things that indicates that they're not is that each iron peak is not just a zone of reprecipitated iron, but these are thin laminated zones that have different grain size. They have different structures, different depositional structures than what's above or below. So it does appear that we're capturing kind of unique sedimentary units. We also now are going through and doing things like clay mineralogy and radiogenics to try to source exactly where they come from, which brings me to the second part of your question, which is that in certain parts of this, we do see a lot of, for example, basaltic material coming from Siberia. So there are different parts of the record where we see impact of different mineral and sediment sources that are different delivery mechanisms. These fine-grained clay layers generally appear both from the clay mineralogy and radiogenics to be from Svalbard.
That's time for one more question.
Yeah, just building off on the previous question. So the fact that the source of the sediment comes from relatively iron-rich areas, does that imply farther in the geologic past, like Ice Age, Earth, that that the iron cycle was different, or just in general, if the ice sheets are on different geologic areas, that you'd have a different iron cycling, and should that like cause us to like maybe rethink how the iron cycle might have worked in the past?
Yeah, so I think it's both. So one of the reasons we think about this a lot is that the iron is delivering a lot of that material, thinking about the modern example. The ice sheets, the paleo ice sheets, but the glaciers that are still there, and the ice sheets on some of the other islands in the archipelago are delivering a lot of reactive iron. Some of that is definitely due to the specific sediment source, but not all of it. So in most glacial settings, we see highly reactive iron than say a non-glacially impacted setting. So part of it's just the physical processing. And again, a lot of different kinds of sediments or bedrock sources can have a decent amount of iron that'll behave a little differently. But as long as there's iron, it's just more efficient at keeping it in solution. This is a place that we see something a little bit more extreme because of the specific bedrock. When we're thinking about the modern iron cycle, one of our concerns is, or one of the things that we think about is that as Arctic shelf seas become less ice covered, we expect them to no longer be light limited, but to be iron limited. And so what we think is going to happen is that as a lot of these glaciers move from being what we call tidewater glaciers to move away from that place where they can have that impact to get material off of the shelf, we will not see the same impact. So again, that'll be more exaggerated on Svalbard because it's a combination of glacial processes plus bedrock, but anywhere that has iron-rich bedrock, no matter what it is, will likely see some example of this, and anywhere that's glacially impacted will have more of an impact than a place that's not.
Awesome, thank you so much, Alan. For an effort